The idea of a poor widow giving her last little coin, a coin we often call the mite, a mite, stays with us as the image of the least who has given the most, the person who has struggled and still generously praises God. Certainly, Jesus commends her generosity because of her humility and points her out to his followers because she gives despite the troubles and challenges of her life. It's an admirable quality in a person, worthy of commending to others, to have very little and to still respond generously, to be tired, exhausted even, and to still work with some energy for the sake of another, to be afraid and to still step out in some courageous manner, to give out of one's poverty. We can see why Jesus commends this widow's act to those he is teaching, and yet there's more going on here. This story is not only a commendation, it is also a condemnation. Jesus pairs the generous poor widow and her tiny mite coin with the learned, status-grabbing scribes with their fancy robes, maybe something like this, and their public acts of piety, maybe something like this. While the widow is commended for generosity and humility, the scribes are being condemned for greedy, oppressive practices and their status-seeking pride. In the couple of verses leading up to our text this morning, Jesus talks with some of the scribes about the relationship between King David and the Messiah. Many people were expecting a Messiah figure to rise up and lead God's people as King David once did. And a few Sundays back, you might remember James and John asked Jesus if they could sit on his right and on his left when he came into his glory because they expected some type of coup d'etat to overthrow Herod and for Jesus to be that governor under the Roman authorities. Jesus tries over and over again to tell them this isn't how it's going to be, to tell them that the type of kingdom he has come to establish is a kingdom that is not based on an earthly ruler, but a kingdom where the power of God's shalom, God's justice, God's loving kindness, God's ability to make peace where there is strife, that would reign through the hearts and actions of every person. Not an earthly reign, but a reign through the hearts and hands of God's people. That's hard to absorb, especially for scribes who had some power in their current political system. Now, Jesus does not critique the fact that the scribes have that power. He critiques how they misuse it, how they demand the best seats, and so forth. Jesus goes beyond the outward signs of their status-seeking ways to even critique the economic practices that perhaps were cheating widows after their homes, after their husbands died. Jesus says that they devour widows' houses. This text gives us two instructions as followers of Jesus' teachings. First, we are to be generous even when we feel poor, and we are to behave in ways that are just and loving and peacemaking towards other people. They go hand in hand. Not only does Jesus want to see the kind of generous living that changes the balance of our checking account, Jesus wants to see a change in the balance of our lives, our motivations, our behaviors. Jesus wants us to move toward ways of living together that bless those who struggle rather than taking advantage of them. Jesus wants us to reach out in blessing in the very places where our society has become accustomed to oppressing, to bless instead of oppressing. I'm really proud of the Episcopal Diocese of Maryland, and I'm really proud of our vestry for making a commitment to having a living wage for all members of our staff, for moving our parish staff wages toward a living wage based on the cost of living in Howard County. How could we move toward that widow's mite generosity if we are devouring widows' houses, so to speak? How could we become a community of generous and abundant, Christ-like love if we are taking economic advantage of those who are employed in ministry alongside us? We must always be mindful of those economic systems in which we operate. At a recent PTA meeting, I learned that the teachers in Howard County schools are less economically able to live in the county in which they teach than are their counterparts in all the surrounding counties. These are complex concerns, and there are so many interrelated budget issues involved. As Christians, we are called to ponder these concerns carefully, to discern, and perhaps to advocate. Not only does Jesus esteem generous giving out of thanksgiving to God, as the widow did, we are cautioned by Jesus against participating in practices that might economically disadvantage other people, especially those already struggling. This has nothing to do with political parties and everything to do with discerning carefully how to live as a justice-seeking people. Jesus wants all of us, our whole self, not just our generous checks, but all of us, the whole of us. Now I need to pause for just a short caveat about generous checks. We know that generous checks feed and clothe the hungry. There's power in that. We know that generous checks educate new generations of Christians, that generous checks can pay for BG&E in the winter and prescription expenses for those who can't afford it. We know that generous checks make a difference. Generous checks allow us to minister to one another in times of joy and in times of sorrow. And yet Jesus asks for more, for generous checks and more. Jesus also wants our hearts and our minds and our actions, our whole selves. Some of you have heard this story. Now that I've been ordained almost 10 years, I may be repeating myself sometimes in sermons. I hear that happens. So if you've heard this story before, I apologize, but it's kind of exciting, so I think you'll like it again. Some of you have already heard it. It's about the time my friend Heidi took me bungee jumping. Now, before you think I'm an adrenaline junkie, which I'm definitely not, I don't do this kind of thing very much. This was before children. This was while I was discerning a call to ordination, and I was out visiting her in Oregon, and it just seemed like a thing to do. Here's what I want to share with you. Here's what I remember from that experience, in addition to the brief sensation of flying, and then the longer sensation of falling, and then that strange sensation of bouncing like some little toy at the end of a string and a cat batting at you, just bouncing, right? My friend Heidi was then a prosecutor in the district attorney's office in Portland, Oregon, and a bunch of other attorney friends of hers met us out along this old logging bridge in Washington State, out over this deep ravine, 2 tall mountains coming up, Mount St. Helens in the distance. It was beautiful. The bungee master, who had this all set up for us, gave us important directions as we were being strapped into harnesses. And, that's the kind of moment in your life where you're really paying attention. There's a lot of things where you can kind of tune things out. I remember every word he said. I was really paying attention. Here's what he said. This is not about taking a risk. You think you came here because you're taking a risk bungee jumping. This is not about taking a risk. This bungee jump is about commitment. When you jump off that platform on the edge of this bridge today, commit to it. Don't just fall and think you've done something cool by taking a risk. Look out over the ravine, find a tree out there in the distance, brace yourself and jump towards that tree with everything that is in you. Commit to it. Now remember, I was discerning a call to the priestly vocation at the time, so his words seemed really on point. Commitment. Commitment. Jump towards that tree with everything that is in you. Everyone who came to bungee jump that day, bungee jumped, except for one guy, Tom. He changed his mind at the last minute. There's no shame in that. It's a long way down. And so we jumped, and then we were getting the harnesses off, and it was time to write checks. The amount was something like $100, and I was leaning on the truck bed, sort of writing my check out to the bungee master for this adrenaline sort of experience that was still, flowing through my veins at that point. And I handed him my check, and I shook his hand, and I thanked him for, the fact that I was still alive, and, for doing this and knowing how to do this. And then the guy behind me, Tom, who changed his mind at the last minute, he had his check, and he was handing it to the bungee master, and the bungee master said, "Nope, you don't jump, you don't pay." Tom says, "Well, no, man, you came out here, your guys are out here, all harnessed up. I said I was going to do this. Just, take the check, because, I caused you some work today, da-da-da." And the bungee master says, "Not going to take your check. You don't jump, you don't pay." So then Tom thinks he's really slick, and he's going to kind of slip it in the window into the truck, so that it sits on the seat. And bungee master said, "You can put your check in there, but I will not cash it." Tom is a defense attorney, and he's kind of the sort who's used to getting what he wants in life, or at least making a darn good case about it. And he gets a little rattled by this interaction with the bungee master. And he looks pretty agitated, and I think, gosh, he's getting kind of angry. But what happened next was Tom walked over to that platform and said to one of the guys, "Harness me up." Put the harness on, and he did it. Couldn't do it before, but by golly, if he couldn't buy his way out, he was going to jump his way out, and then that bungee master would take the check, which is exactly what happened. He took his check. Jesus desires our commitment to his way, our participation, our engagement in his kingdom. Not our idea of what that is, but God's idea. We might try to buy our way out of this participation, out of this engagement with checks, and yet Jesus wants our whole self to participate. Jesus calls on that which is deep within us, that is humble and generous, to act in the ways he taught us, drawing us away from pride and greed and moving us into that kingdom he proclaimed. Today we turn in our pledge cards in support of the mission and ministry of Jesus' kingdom as we discern it unfolding around us. This morning we commit financially to the ongoing work of Christian people in this place to care for those who are in need. Today we commit to participating in the thrilling work of following Christ together, and we commit to this adventure of living fully in the generous and just and peace-building love of God.